Welcome to episode 161 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. It's April 10, 1910, Montevideo, Parque Central, around 3,000 spectators. And what begins as a good football match ends as something much larger. River Plate of Montevideo host Alumni of Buenos Aires and win 2-1. That in itself is already newsworthy enough. Alumni were not just another visiting side. They were the great Argentine team of the age, the aristocrats of earlier Rio de la Plata football, a club so strong that beating them meant something on both shores. But the deeper reason this day matters is hanging on the players' backs, because River Plate do not beat Alumni in their usual red and white stripes. They cannot. The shirts are too similar. So River change. They pull on a sky blue alternate shirt. And from that practical little solution comes one of the most enduring visual identities in world football, because that sky blue would soon become Uruguay's national color. And that is why Uruguay, more than a century later, are still La Celeste. But how did we get here? To understand this afternoon, you have to start with the Rio de la Plata itself. In the early years of South American football, Buenos Aires and Montevideo were not distant cousins. They were in constant conversation. Ships, trade, newspapers, schools, British railwaymen, clerks, engineers, teachers and merchants moved ideas across the estuary all the time. Football was one of those ideas. So the rivalry came early. By 1910, Uruguay and Argentina had already been playing internationals against each other for years. The first official match had been in 1902, the first international played outside the British Isles. Cups followed quickly. Lipton, Newton, honor trophies, club meetings, representative matches. The river didn't divide the football cultures, it intensified them. And in those years, both River Plate of Montevideo and Alumni of Buenos Aires were pioneers in that world. Alumni were the established power. They were the great old giant of Argentine amateur football, born out of the Buenos Aires English high school tradition, loaded with the Brown brothers and surrounded by an aura of British discipline, education and excellence. If you wanted a symbol of Argentine football's first age, you could do far worse than Alumni. River Plate of Montevideo were different. They were one of the strong criollo clubs of early Uruguay, already league champions by 1908, ambitious, local, increasingly important, and carrying that slightly defined energy that matters in a young football culture. They didn't yet have the myth of Nacional or the later weight of Peñarol, but they were real, and they were good. Now add the shirts. Today we think of kits as branding, marketing, fashion, nostalgia, collector culture. In 1910, they were more basic than that. Heavy fabric, colors, simpler cuts, no sponsors, no television, no global rollout. But that doesn't mean they were unimportant. Quite the opposite. By then, colors already mattered because football had inherited a British culture of visible distinction. Teams needed to tell themselves apart. Clubs began to attach themselves to colors that became habits, then signatures, and then identities. In other words, early kits were practical first, symbolic second, but the symbolism was already growing. And around the Rio de la Plata, where British influence had helped plant the sport, that mattered a great deal. Uruguay's own national side had not yet settled on a permanent look. In those earliest years, they wore remarkable variety. Colors borrowed from Albion, combinations with diagonal sashes, plain shirts, striped shirts. Argentina too took a little while to settle, but by 1908 had effectively landed on the sky blue and white striped identity that would endure. So on April 10, 1910, when Alumni arrived in Montevideo in red and white, vertical stripes, and River Plate's first choice shirt was too close for comfort, this was not a trivial inconvenience. It was a football problem. And football, even then, solved those problems visually. River changed into sky blue. That choice was made for the afternoon, but it lasted for history. Now to the match itself. The cast was proper early Rio de la Plata football. River Plate lined up with Cavalotti in goal, José Miguel Benincasa in defense, Luriet, Sanz and Garcia across the middle, then Modena, Dacal, Dagosti, Raimonda, and Seoane. Alumni brought Hardy, Jorge Brown and Juan Brown, Gallup, Laurie and Jacobs, then Weiss, Alfredo and Juancito Brown, Morgan and Clark. There, in one line, you can already hear the period. Browns everywhere, old school surnames, British inheritance all over the team sheet, the game itself beginning to pass from expatriate custody into something more local, more mixed, more South American. The visitors scored first through vice. That was the script. Alumni were meant to come over, remind Montevideo who they were, and head back across the water with their authority intact. But River turned it. Pablo Dacal equalized. Then D'Agosti scored the winner. River Plate 2, Alumni 1. That was the result, but it was also more than a result. It was an upset with consequence. Because this was widely treated as a feat of genuine significance. An Uruguayan side defeating the era's great Argentine club in Montevideo, and doing so while wearing a shirt they had not intended to make famous. You can imagine how that landed on each side of the river. In Montevideo, it was pride, not just because River had won, but because one of theirs had beaten the standard bearer from Buenos Aires. In BA, it was not the collapse of a dynasty. Alumni was still alumni, but it was a jolt, a reminder that the football conversation across the water was no longer one way. And then comes the part that lifted the match out of club history and international mythology. Soon afterward, the question arose, what should Uruguay wear for the next international against Argentina? And here, the key figure enters. Ricardo Lebas, delegate of Montevideo Wanderers, proposed that Uruguay adopt the same sky blue River had worn against Alumni in tribute to that victory. The idea was backed by Héctor Rivadavia Gómez, then president of the Uruguayan football authorities, and 6 years later, the creator and first president of CONMEBOL. So this wasn't merely a whim in a dressing room. It was a football political decision made by men who were helping shape the structure of the South American game itself. And on August 15, 1910, Uruguay wore the sky blue shirt for the first time in an international and beat Argentina 3-1 in the Copa Lipton. That is the hinge. Because now the color was no longer River Plate's emergency solution. It was Uruguay's national image. And once a national team finds the shirt that feels like itself, all kinds of things begin to attach to it. Pride attaches to it. Memory attaches to it. Victory attaches to it. And eventually, destiny attaches to it. That is what happened with Celeste. At first it was a tribute, then it became identity, and then it became inheritance. And because Uruguay did what Uruguay did in the decades that followed, the shirt gained an almost spiritual charge. Olympic gold in 1924, Olympic gold again in 1928, the first World Cup in 1930, Maracanã in 1950. By then, the color was not merely a color, it was a manner of entering the field, calmly, proudly, perhaps smaller than the opponent sometimes, but never lesser. Celeste became less a design choice than a moral tone. And that is why this story matters, not because shirts create greatness by themselves, they don't of course, but because football so often needs one visible object in which a country can store its feeling about itself. For Brazil, yellow. For Argentina, the stripes. For Italy, azzurro. And for Uruguay, celeste. And once that connection is made, it survives everything else. The fabric changes, the color changes, the shorts change, the crest evolves, the tailoring modernizes. The shirt becomes lighter, tighter, cleaner, more commercial, more global. But the color stays. And now, of course, there are 4 stars above the AUF badge. Not 2, but 4. 2 for the World Cups of 1930 and 1950, and 2 for the Olympic football titles of 1924 and 28, which Uruguay and FIFA have long treated as world championships of their era. So the modern shirt says something interesting. It carries a color born from a club-level improvisation in 1910, and stars earned by a national team that turned that color into one of football's great uniforms. And what are the clubs from that original afternoon? That is part of the poetry too. Alumni disappeared. The old River Plate FC of Montevideo disappeared too. And yet one Sunday at Parque Central outlived them both. That is football history at its best. A match can vanish from the standings and still survive in the bloodstream. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 10, 1910. First, this was a major win in its own time. River Plate of Montevideo beat the mighty Alumni, and that mattered deeply in the early Rio de la Plata rivalry. Second, hits in 1910 were already more important than they might look from a distance. They were practical identifiers, but also fast becoming symbols of club and national self-recognition. And third, Uruguay Celeste was born not from flag design or committee theory, but from a football accident, a shirt clash that became a national emblem. On this day in 1910, River Plate of Montevideo beat Alumni 2-1 at Parque Central in a sky blue chain shirt, and from that improvised strip came the color that would make Uruguay forever Celeste. That is all for episode 161 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share it with a football friend. Tomorrow, we go to April 11, 2001, when Australia beat American Samoa 31-0 in a World Cup qualifier, about consequences that absurd scoreline had for the game. See you then.